Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name's Alec McCutcheon from Unicom. We're very pleased to be holding the webinar today. The theme of today's presentation is Enterprise DevOps Lessons for 2016. And our guest speaker, I'm very pleased to advise, is Rob Vanstone. Rob is Technical Director at XebiaLabs. And today he's going to look back at lessons learned from implementing DevOps and continuous delivery during the last year, 2015, and also talk then about what it means for 2016. So this is going to be a very interesting webinar, I think, and we look forward to getting your feedback. There'll be lots of opportunity for questions at the end, so please have your questions ready if you type them in at the end. And we will be making available a recording of this presentation and the slides afterwards. We'll send you a link for those so that you can watch it again and also obviously share with your colleagues. So without further ado, I will hand over to Rob.
Thank you very much, Alec. That's a very kind introduction. Hello, everyone. As Alex said, I'm Rob Vanstone and I work at XebiaLabs, and throughout my kind of role here at XebiaLabs, some of it is about presenting what we see in the industry. We come across many of you through our endeavour to sell our products, but we also try and perform a thought leadership role within this industry and specifically around continuous delivery and DevOps. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Unicom for the opportunity. Just a little bit about myself, really. I don't want to talk too much about me, but I have a background in both development, operations, and some testing as well, and I have kind of a grasp of the insights, but a lot's changed since I've moved to this organisation. I keep try and keep current on the development practices and remember what it was like when I was doing that kind of work, and things have changed quite a lot, as we'll see in the presentation. I'm also, you might have seen me at some of the meetups and conferences that we do, so we're always about, and if you do see me, grab me and we can have a chat, coffee, whatever. And I think it's probably fair to just talk a little bit about XebiaLabs. Why do we do what we do? What qualifies us as a company to have opinions on these matters? Well, we're basically an enterprise continuous delivery company, and I know this is a claim that we may have heard several times, but what it boils down to for us is to focus on those challenges that large organizations face when they try to make the move to DevOps, continuous delivery, those kind of issues with our tooling. And the large enterprise with lots of teams, many platforms, regulatory requirements, that sort of things you get in organizations that have gone beyond maybe the 5 people in a garage or a Regis office with only a few Amazon servers, for example. What becomes apparent when we look into these organizations is it's not just about the automation, but the visibility and control become much more important. And we've worked extensively in this space, trying to see where the focus splits between automation and the communication, and it's something that's long been recognized by the leading industry analysts, the Gartners, the Forresters, and technology publications we rely on today. So we're a product company, and it's possible, and I hope probable even, that you recognize us from one or more of the products we've developed in this space. Each of our products are targeted at realizing the promises that these transformations in the large enterprise at scale put out there. And we have 3 products. We have a pipeline release orchestration tool, which helps you to define, execute, and I think equally importantly, improve your overall process, called XL Release. And this is truly aimed at addressing that visibility piece whilst integrating your many teams with each other and other tools, automating away those communication bottlenecks and some of the technical bottlenecks you might be facing. So it gives you that understanding of what are the features I'm delivering, or how do they relate to my other DevOps tooling and each other, and when will they be done. In XL Deploy, we have an application deployment tool, and this is focused, laser focused on addressing that pain of getting our software onto our environments, addressing the requirement, I need to get this version into my environment, I need to do this more and more often, handle more technologies, I guess you could say from COBOL to containers, if you like. And XL Test View, a test analytic tool. And one of the trends we're seeing right now is that as we solve the shipping the software faster and more frequently, we need to quickly ensure that what we're shipping is of sufficient quality. And XL Test View is designed to give you that visibility of how good that software is. How good is the software I am shipping by various metrics and all the testing that you might be doing now that you've removed maybe other bottlenecks. So there are three products, XL Release, XL Deploy, and XL Test View. And in this talk, really now, we're going to focus on what we've seen in the last year, in 2015, what we may have learned, and maybe some do's and don'ts, and then what to kind of look for or focus on, if we can, in 2016. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that throughout what we might term the DevOps movement, we've seen a growth in the number of stories that DevOps isn't anymore just the domain of those unicorn type companies. Those, I guess even about a year ago, we were reading blog posts or hearing case studies about these mythical beasts that were fully DevOpsed up, the likes of Flickr and Etsy and Amazon, which were all very good, and they had that wow factor, and this has been going for quite some time. But I think, to be fair, as an industry, we've been hearing about how it could be done for quite some time, and I think to some extent we kind of hardened to those kind of metrics. You've heard them all, you know, the 700 deployments a year, the 10 deployments a day, Amazon deploying every 11.6 seconds. After a while it becomes a little bit, yeah, I get it, but we're not like them. Our business is totally different. And I think, you know, that's fair. It is true. Most organizations are not an Amazon. Their business is different. The existing amount of infrastructure, certainly at that time, was different. Sort of even as early as the beginning of last year, we weren't seeing those stories. So it didn't really feel real amongst the rest of us. The more kind of large enterprise, the banking and insurance and manufacturing, sort of IT manufacturing, where those blends are. And so it's a valid question. How does this work for us? But it did start making us ask that. And I think finding out how some of these lessons could be applicable to us is really what we're all about. But throughout the year and through some pragmatic approaches and some focus on actual goals, that did start to change. And as early as kind of May last year, we were seeing that companies were reporting to us, and companies like the company we are having improvements in their software delivery process. So we were hearing success stories at the Velocity conference, and they were not the Etsys and the Flickrs, but they were organizations like Target and Capital One who gave presentations about what they're doing and what they learned. And we're not just talking about these companies having a single tiger team or a single application, but a much broader transformation, which we see is pretty much, you know, the goal of what we're discussing today. So the stats that start coming out of that were a little more realistic, and the success stories are real. And, you know, in the instance of Capital One, Adam Auerbach gave a great presentation. You can download it, in fact, and listen to it. But it's taken them 3 years. But their Agile Transformation, which I think a lot of us are going through, that move to Agile is causing a bit of disruption, but it also reveals a lot of constraints in the DevOps approach. So their use cases, some interesting things. They had 700 agile teams, or they were managing 200 apps, and they're kind of doing one deployment a month, or that's what, as it came out in that presentation. And that's kind of feels a lot more real about where we want to get to. Obviously, we want to do more, and we want to have those exciting masses of volumes of releases, but that's not necessarily a goal at this stage. I think one of the big lessons they learned, and what I picked out of the talk, was that their manual testing gave way to a lot more automated testing, and that kind of leads back to where we've positioned Excel Test View, that as you need to increase the speed, you also need to make sure that what you're pushing through the pipeline is of sufficient quality. It's no use releasing rubbish and that brings down your system. And we'll talk about this a bit later on. Also, what was highly relevant was that there's a lot of process and cultural changes, and we hear this a lot. Every DevOps conference has a large section about culture that needs to fix. And we'll discuss this a bit more, but I think what some of the takeaways from that are, we're not just throwing problems over the fence to a different team. The attitudes were a lot more collaborative, and trying to take a lot more ownership for the solution that's sitting in front of the customer. So, I think there's a common theme that as organizations move from these unicorn or these non-unicorn organizations, it's much more like reality. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. I don't know how long it took for Amazon to start doing these types of releases and how applicable across the organization is. There isn't much data out there, so I think it's much more reassuring that we hear that yes, it's hard, but it's doable and it's worth it. It won't work immediately, but it's possible. You're not all going to flounder immediately either. Okay, so I think we've covered some of this, and all of those types of metrics feel a bit more real, and just on here. Okay, so from a DevOps perspective, I think the other thing that we're seeing that shows that this is a real thing, that we're moving from the realm of an early adopter to something that's more of a growing market trend, is that there is an ecosystem growing around this. And of course, at the beginning of last year, I guess there were only a handful of niche organizations and companies that were really going into businesses and transforming them. The idea that you could go to a large SI or a large services company and just say, make me DevOps, was still, and still is to some extent, somewhat fanciful, and we'll talk about this a little bit different. But I think what we're seeing is there's a huge difference between just taking ITIL type processes, for example, or renaming those people, those specialists, as DevOps engineers in LinkedIn, and actually changing your organization. So that DevOps, and we'll talk about this later, that DevOps in name only, it doesn't really fly. And we ran a survey actually at the beginning of the year. We do this every year about the state of software delivery, and one of the things that came out of that survey time after time was that organizations regarded a lack of knowledge and expertise in this area as one of the main challenges that stops them going through this transformation. And I think the fact that throughout 2015 we've been seeing a growth, I wouldn't call it a maturity yet, but we are seeing a much more standardized ecosystem around this. And some of that is tooling, and that was one of the forerunners. Tooling is very good to sort of coordinate teams around, but I think over the last couple of years, the idea that there's a DevOps tool out there, I think everyone was branding their products as a DevOps tool. Our VP often tells the joke of, having if you were buying a screwdriver for your rack, it would be a DevOps screwdriver, and I think to some extent that's what you can see, and that's not really helpful for how we might want to work. So there is an enormous divergence of tools here, and it is confusing. So naturally, we do try to make sense of them and categorize them as much. And XebiaLabs actually put out the DevOps periodic table of elements, which is a nice way of categorizing some of the tooling, and even that couldn't account for all of the tooling. It was a really large success. It generated a lot of conversation, and we had the conversations around it like, well, why isn't such and such in there, or X is a DevOps tool, you've missed out on our tool, and all of this, and it just goes to show that there is so much out there that maybe it's a bit more confusing than helpful in branding yourself as a DevOps tool, and yeah. So we are seeing a growth of more established DevOps consultancies now, and towards the end of 2015, I think it would be fair to say that some of those global services companies are actually awake to this fact and providing this kind of support and creating DevOps centers of excellence. And it's certainly, there are teams within those organizations, those very large organizations, that will say, yes, we are a DevOps service or part of the company. And that's right, we need that. There will always be more companies that need assistance than can be served by niche consultancies. That's always going to be the case. And I think for this to really work in our industry and be a broad platform from which companies can improve their software delivery, we're going to need large-scale support. And we can debate long and hard about, the value of getting in a small niche team to revolutionize your system, or actually just having the warm embrace of those large SIs. But I think they have a broad scope and purpose, and it's this ecosystem that we're seeing that's kind of certainly giving us the confidence we're moving into a maturity phase. So it's not just for the realms of the bleeding edge organizations, but we're actually starting to derive value across the board. I think the other thing that gives us some hope here is that even mainstream publications are talking about DevOps, and this was coming out time and time again throughout 2015. So The Economist, for example, produced an article on DevOps, and so that kind of tells us it's becoming much more mainstream. We at XebiaLabs, we were always talking to analysts, and one of the analysts we were talking to was just recounting a conversation he had with the CIO of a major organization, and that gentleman was saying, what's this DevOps thing? What should I do about it? What does it mean? And this happens. This is inevitable. But the fact that there is a perception that everyone's doing it, why aren't I, means that there is a kind of a movement coming about this. We're seeing DevOps pop up on the radar with so many people who are not experts, who have no exposure to the nuances of the tooling and the culture, but they are seeing that there is enough people doing it that maybe they're thinking, yes, there's something here. Again, this is, it's encouraging for us that we're working in a kind of framework that is gaining critical mass, but it does show that there's still some confusion out there that needs to be addressed. Those conversations where people say, I need me some DevOps. If you don't, one of the things we are seeing actually, if that kind of conversation is coming up and you don't really understand what it is, you don't really understand the value it will give you, you could go down the road of spending a lot of money DevOpsing up your organization and end up with this kind of heap of stuff that you kind of look back and think, well, was that worth it? And I think there is no blueprint yet, and that's quite obvious at the moment. The Agile Manifesto is a set of high-level statements, and I think what enterprises need is a set of guidelines on what they should put in place. What should I focus on? How could I get started? And if you look at those other methodologies, if you like, that come out, ITIL, CMMI, they do come with that clear implementation blueprint. Now, obviously a blueprint is not a successful implementation, but it is somewhere you can start from. And it is a group of ideas that you can say, let's change the way we work, let's adopt some of this, some of that. It's in line with the goals that we want to achieve. And we're seeing this becoming a bit more of a challenge in the DevOps space. But we are getting a growing body of evidence, some lessons learned, which again we will discuss today, from those early adopters. So what have we learned? You know, what does this thing look like in practice? What does DevOps mean in the enterprise? And we have it certainly in all the events and conversations and meetups and conferences we have. It's drummed in nearly every session. It's where DevOps is this. Everyone's working together. We all understand each other. Common goals, communication, collaboration. All of these are right, but that doesn't really translate into something that we can physically see and understand. I think one of the first things to note, and something that we've learned through the last year, is it's still very much an internal IT initiative, and that kind of, you know, DevOps is supposed to be all-encompassing. It's supposed to be that communication to everyone, but of course we all want to accelerate. We all want to become more responsive, be a better service provider. We've heard this a few times, but the reality is that the business don't tend to get involved with this process just yet. We're seeing right now, certainly at the sort of tail end of last year and the beginning of this year, we're seeing that it is largely run by the CTO, CIO function. And in fact, I do make a point. I visit customers and prospects quite frequently, and I ask the direct questions that, you know, where is this initiative coming from? You're looking for products, you're looking for ways of working. Who's driving this? Is this coming from your business? And without fail, every organization I've spoken to it's an IT initiative. And I ask the question, do you have influence on the way the business are working? And that's, again, something that I'm seeing that's not quite there yet. We're not really able just to change the nature of the whole organization to match what we're trying to achieve with DevOps, and that's the state of play today. And I think whatever the story is, it is more likely that it's in your IT organization. But I wouldn't be too ashamed of this, because I think we've come a long way. Initially, this might have been shadow IT, or this might have been something your development team just ran off and started to do. So we are seeing a big difference. The fact that C-level executives are still are in the picture is incredible. But I think running from within the technical side of the business does mean that it translates into very IT specific metrics. You know, the reduction of defects or efficiency improvements. None of these really matter directly too much to the business unless, you know, there is a direct reference from concept to cash, or reducing the costs so that business ideas can be experimented on and tried out. I think when people mention accelerated delivery to market, they're kind of very much internal technical accelerations, like I can get into the QA environment within a week, or we're doing 2 weekly sprints. I think it's difficult right now to say, yes, implement DevOps, it's a game changer for your business, you will outflank all of your competitors and everything will be rosy. It's not there yet. I don't think it's a business revolution yet. It certainly is an IT revolution. So, again, one of the things we've learned that there are two distinct types of DevOps. I think we can refer to them, we can give them any labels you like. We can call them simple and advanced, or unicorn and non-unicorn. It doesn't, I don't think it helps the conversation really to put kind of value statements on the labels, but we are definitely seeing two distinct types. And the first type, I think we're all very familiar with, is focused on that automation piece. And that's natural. This is an area that addresses pain quickest in general. And I think by introducing significant amounts of automation into processes that once were very manual, uncoordinated, error-prone, things like creating environments or having a release process, whatever it is, we can get quick wins. We can up our frequency. We can reduce our error rate. And I think a lot of basic DevOps is really not dramatically changing the attitudes or the way we're thinking about delivering software or delivering features. It's kind of applying the same approach we do today, but automate as much as possible. Now, don't get me wrong, this is very important, and it is actually a foundation for anything else you might want to achieve. And it does deliver an enormous amount of benefit really quickly. But it doesn't change some of the fundamental organizational constraints you might have. It would still fit in a silo-based organization that's largely focused on operations. And while there's a lot of noise and hype, and there's a lot of feeling that, yes, I've implemented tool A or tool B, it's still very internally focused. These are the kind of conversations that don't really excite your business owners or product owners too much, because they still know that there is a huge delay in maybe getting the features through layers of testing or different areas of the organization. And I think the type 2 organization are those ones that have really thought at a fundamental level about how you change the way you deliver software. And those kind of thoughts are not just limited to the technical challenges, but and not just on automation, although that's a big part of it. It's more about how do we best make use of that? How do we deliver our features? Why do we deliver slowly? What is causing us to deliver slowly? And when we speak to our customers and speak to organizations in the industry, we find that releases are thought of as big things. And we get answers along the lines of, well, a release, it has to be a big thing. We have to write a press release about this, or it has to be a big change with lots of features, very cool to recapture our customers. But if you look at those type 2 organizations, those unicorns, if you like, again, and some of the organizations that are now following hard on their footsteps, like Capital One, like Target, they're starting to learn to think of releases differently. They learn to think that it actually is possible to get relatively small things into production and still meet those audit or regulatory requirements. And then you can start thinking about doing these small things much more often, and maybe being even a bit more experimental about, just trying something out, reverting it in a subsequent release if you need to, or dispensing with it. I think, and we all know this, the traditional way we deliver software is maybe to do all the research up front, do the market research, interview lots of people, do some user experience testing and polling, design the perfect set of features. And the reality, of course, that this often never works. And everyone's read, since Agile was being promoted from the outset, that 80% of these IT projects are failing. Now, a famous study actually more recently, and this came out last year, related to Bing, is roughly a third of the features that they were delivering had a positive effect, a third had a neutral effect, and a third were actually negative. Now, I know this is only a single study, but it does feel fairly representative from those large scoped projects that we've seen. And you've spent a third of your time maybe developing those features that actually cause you harm, and 2/3 of your time delivering almost no value. So it's something to dwell on, and more research is showing the same thing. So I think one thing that DevOps can do is draw as some kind of natural conclusion is that we should experiment more. And that mentality theme comes in, and it's a much bigger step to take. You need to have these discussions with the project managers and the business, not just the technology. And that's what organizations that move in this way, the Type 2 organizations, do start to do. And they're not just doing it blindly. It's not a matter of, oh, I've been told we need to become a Type 2 organization, we need to do a lot more DevOps for the sake of doing DevOps. But it's actually working together to design a system that's good for our customers to use. And it's that collaboration across the piece. As a developer, I'm not just coding to a Jira ticket, knowing that something with my code will happen down the line, or if I'm a tester and I test something, and while I know it works and achieves the use case I've got in front of me, I can't see that it really makes sense to a customer. These sorts of thought processes have just got to go away. And so these are the hallmarks of the Type 2. And it delivers enormous benefit, but it is definitely somewhat harder to do. And I think it's that ownership of what we're putting in front of our customers from everyone who's involved that starts to improve what we're releasing. And I think, you know, we need to be cognizant of the fact that yes, this is hard and it does cause a lot of disruption, and we don't necessarily all have to move in this way. We need to make these decisions based on what we want to achieve. And bear in mind that it will require large-scale changes to our organization. Okay, so what have we learned about how to implement DevOps? So I'm going to speed up a little bit. I want to have a bit of time for questions. But I think a few things that we've seen is that it's a very common theme we're seeing, is it doesn't just need top-down diktats, or it can't just grow from the bottom up, but it does need both. So it needs top-down engagement and bottom-up growth. This obviously has to be signed off at the highest levels, and an appreciation that as an organization we're going to go through this change, and yes, it's okay to change how we work and remove some of those roadblocks, and we need support and the authority to do this. But the implementation, the automation, the provisioning, the figuring out what it means for every team and technology has to be driven from the bottom up. It really doesn't work to enforce this from the top down if it doesn't fit the team. But at that level, we can set some broad goals and let the teams figure out, self-organize if you like, on how to solve the challenges and achieve those goals. But they do need the full support of certainly the technology management, but more than likely the entire business. And there's too many cases where trying to enforce this from the top down just doesn't work when it doesn't fit the team. But at the same time, when we try and do this from the bottom up, when development teams run away and try to do more and more, we hit problems with scaling, and there's a limit to what our teams and our operations staff can do in their spare time when it's not fully sanctioned. We found out that automation and coding fundamentals are key for the new ops. I mean, system administration is a software development discipline now. It's that simple. There is no more rack and stack. There is some capacity planning, but we're not looking at Visio diagrams so much anymore. You are going to be figuring out what a virtual data center might look like. How can we manage 10,000 servers per person? And this is not going to happen with people whose primary skill and focus has always been on a physical, logistical skill set. But the good news is that most of our team members in this space are really eager to do this. It's much more fun to do this automation than to be pushing paper and organizing things to be delivered into a data center. And there are certainly team members within our groups that have a strong appetite for this. And I think it's, one of the things we've learned is it's key to figure out who they are, get them the skills, get them the tools, get them the training. Yes, developers tend to understand loads about writing software, but they don't necessarily appreciate in an ops sense what it means to run their stuff on infrastructure at scale. And it's not as though you can easily get the developers just to code the infrastructure, because our ops teams have an awful lot of domain knowledge about running these things at scale. So it's essential we retain that knowledge. We just need to make sure that they can do this with the appropriate tooling. We can't expect this to happen if we're just letting them rely on the old legacy tooling that they've been using today. We need the most appropriate tools and to give them the most appropriate training. Another aspect about what we've learned this year is measuring things, making them visible. And one of the challenges we've seen through DevOps from the business perspective is it's very much a black box. It's very difficult to get support and buy-in and the budget really from the skeptics when you just say, don't worry, we've got this covered with our DevOps box. Yeah, we're building this magic box, it's going to be perfect. For the top-down layer who are giving the money, we need to make this much more transparent. And it's not just a good idea just to win over business or get the funding from them, but it's kind of at the core of what openness DevOps approaches mean. And I think as organizations, we have to learn that there's no shame to realize that it's hard and it actually takes longer than we thought, as long as we're showing that why it's hard, what's going on. I don't think there's any mileage in pretending it's going to be perfect. It never happens. So prepare from the beginning. Get the measurements, get the data, make it all visible. There are some projects, even now who are going through this that maybe move from 1 deployment a week to 10 deployments a day. And there are others who have not managed to make this. Why is that? What is blocking them? What can we measure to help move those along as well? And I think at this point it's helpful to kind of distinguish the difference between the means of doing something and the goals we want to achieve. Sure, we can throw a lot of tooling at the problem. There's tons of tooling out there to do so, but tooling isn't the goal. It's just something we use and implement to make something happen. And the tendency in some organizations, or certainly in teams of organizations, saying, yeah, well, we've implemented Puppet, Chef, Ansible, whatever, Excel deploy, and, well, that's kind of irrelevant to the business. That's not a goal. What is the business benefit of implementing some tooling? It may be some box checking at best, but what can we do with this tooling? What can we do now that we have all these things hooked together? What do we want to achieve? Now that's what we should be driving for. Tools should have followed that question, I think, not really the other way around. I think another thing, and we talk about an incremental approach here, is when we're looking at managers now, we're not looking at people who conduct or organize or manage, say, a release. We're looking at people that solve problems. It's not as though you can take a manager, for example, and say, look, here's what I want to do, architect the system and get this done. That's not what we mean here. That's not really, they're not really in a position to guide an implementation. I think what the critical role of management has is evaluating and following up on any data that we receive from that implementation. Why are we having a failure here? Are we not getting support from a particular department? Is it technical, or is it an organizational change? Why did it take the network team 8 days to change a firewall rule? So they not only need to understand the organization, but they actually also have to have the authority to make changes to address those issues. And it's no coincidence. I mean, this sounds a lot like a Scrum Master, right? And it's no surprise. It's a very similar concept. I think some excellent reading here is a book by Gary Groover and Tommy Mouser from their experiences at HP, leading the transformation, bringing about this transformation in HP. And it talks a lot about problem solvers, people who are fighting the challenges that they're faced and have the authority to do so. Another thing is to expect failures and some pushback. You know, what we're learning is it's a long haul, especially if we want to go beyond that basic automation to becoming an experimental organization. And it's true, implementing automation can be perceived as a threat. And, you know, all the companies that look like a type 1, automation companies, the reality is very different, actually. Very, very few companies that have embraced automation and automated as much as possible are cutting back on their team members. They're a lot more to happen within the organization. So we're not really seeing the fact that this is going to take away my job pan out. I think the ones that really perceive this threat, though, are those managers in the silos, that may be those traditional gatekeepers holding up the process. As we break down those silos, those roles tend not to be needed anymore. So the idea of a release manager that's just ticking a spreadsheet to ensure that all of these things happen in order, that role is changing. And I think companies that are more sort of continuous delivery need to start whether or not they think that, you know, whether they need the process these managers own. And as those processes go away, then yes, certain kind of roles do go away, and that's where you might get some pushback. And sort of, you know, in this kind of what have we learned space, spreading knowledge is the key thing here. Most organizations perceive lack of knowledge as the biggest problem, or have done, and the tendency is they create a tiger team. They'll get that tiger team to do DevOps somewhere, and it will work, and they'll get it working. But then they'll become reliant on that team to make it work everywhere else. And I don't think that's really a pattern that works very well here. We don't want to have that dependency. The whole creating a DevOps center of excellence as a team in and of itself isn't what DevOps is about. I think much better, but slower, is to use the experiences of that tiger team, and probably most of you have gone through this, to spread that knowledge to other teams. Maybe hire out members of that team to become facilitators. Make the other teams independent, and this as an organizational level gives you a lot more benefits, and you might find as an organization you're much more willing to experiment and learn, and people are more engaged. Okay, so I'll be fairly quick to kind of summarize all of this. I think some of the do's and don'ts we've worked through here are the fact that, yes, do invest in automation, do invest in the training for your ops team, identify those staff who have this appetite. It's hard to be competitive as an organization if you have a person that can only manage one server, or an admin for maybe a handful of servers, but your competitors can manage hundreds and scale up. And I think admins in general need to learn to work with far more infrastructure, more ephemeral infrastructure that's there 1 minute and gone the next perhaps. But to do that they need the training and they need the tools, and that requires the investment. And again, this comes back to that top-down support. I think introduce visibility, communication. Don't be ashamed of the metrics that are coming out of your process. People need to see this. We need to understand the end-to-end picture. Maybe we need to give testers much more influence on whether their use cases make sense. And there's a lot of ways you can start to do this. Perhaps you can change reward and recognition structures that don't just focus on how many defects you raise or how many defects you fix, but actually something that's a bit more end-to-end. Like, how many useful features have I got into my production environment? And how do you measure those? And I think that kind of visibility is important. You know, you might need to start looking at metrics within DevOps a lot more closely from a DevOps perspective. What are useful features? How am I getting feedback from my customers? Is it increasing our revenue? Have we got more people signing on to our application? Are we taking market share from our customers? And tying those metrics with what you're testing or what you're developing is something to focus on. And I think another do is look at your own goals and what what DevOps means to you. If it's more helpful to not even call it DevOps, and I've been in some organizations where they'll openly say DevOps has got a bad name here, or Agile even has got a bad name here, but that's not because of the principles themselves. That's just because it may have been focused on, we need to do DevOps, we need to do Agile. So ignore the word DevOps. Think of it more of a toolkit that you can use with others to achieve your own goals. And if you think of it in this way, think of what you want to achieve and then kind of borrow the mindset, maybe the tooling that the DevOps movement is providing. If you need to engage your staff more, there's lots of ways that you can do that. And some of the don'ts, and I'm conscious of time, I want to leave some time for questions, but some of the don'ts: don't rely on a bottom-up approach. This is where everyone we've encountered starts, and fairly frustrating from a tool vendor perspective, because everyone wants to build stuff themselves and string together those things themselves. But it's a natural behavior. If you haven't got that support, but you know there are good ways of doing things, ultimately people will try and do these things themselves. Now, that works for maybe one team or one application, but then when you try and spread that across, you end up with a lot of unstandardized ways of doing things. And I think as a group, as an organization, which is the very definition of the word, we need to focus on that. And to do that, we need the top-down support. Again, reiterate the fact that DevOps and CD, they're a means to an end. They're not the end themselves. You haven't finished when you've done DevOps. And implementing blindly a suite of tools does not mean you've done DevOps either. And I think one of the things that comes out very strongly is as we increase the frequency of our releases, and if that's a goal that we have, it's very important not to forget that you need to verify your quality in an automated way as well. If testing becomes a bottleneck, if it becomes very difficult for your teams or the people with that role to analyze that feature or application and figure out whether it's good or not, whether it meets the criteria or not, if that becomes hard, people will stop doing it. Testing's become one of those forgotten children in some areas, and if it's circumvented, you may have a really great pipeline that's shipping not very great stuff into your production environment. So embrace the automation that testing's going through at the moment. And then have that great problem of having so much test data you don't know what to do with. Okay, so I'll briefly go through some of the focus points. I think having that executive support and a central group is important. Figure out where you want to be, what your goals are throughout the year, and whether or not your organization is suited to go beyond a type 1 into a type 2 sort of area. And it may be you're not. You may have too much to do to break down silos or whatever. So, but there's still a lot you can do to improve the sort of delivery of your software. How do you want to interact with your existing framework? How are you managing what features you're creating? How are you managing your products, projects, and the backlogs? How are you managing change and release? And that's a big area to focus on, because a lot of large organizations have a lot of process here that add certainly a level of control that may be required for regulatory reasons. It's identifying what value they're adding to your process, and if they're saving you billions of pounds in fines, then you work around those things, because that will put you out of business far quicker than slow release times. So figure out how you interact with what you do today, and look for practices and tooling that can really integrate with those things. And I think for 2016, and I've not really mentioned it a huge amount, but keep an eye out for containers. There are a lot of positive signs coming out from using tooling in this way, but there is a lot of immaturity in this space. So I don't think, again, in the same way that I need me some DevOps, I don't think there is really a huge argument for just turning your business upside down because you need me some containers. There's a lot you can do with your current plan and your current cloud strategic decisions that will also eventually work in that container type model. So throwing that out in favor of something else may not be the best decision for you. And I think we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're going for a much more structured approach as a industry, and I think steer clear of kind of going from dinosaur to DevOps in name only dinosaur. Actually focus on your goals. So with that, I'll hand back to Alec, and if there are any questions, maybe we've got a few minutes to go through some of those. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. That's really good. I'm just having a look to see. I think there's a couple of questions coming in. The first one, what typical metrics would show an ROI for DevOps?
Okay, I guess an ROI for DevOps is probably something we can talk at great length about. I think and I covered it a bit earlier as well, I think some of the traditional metrics of how many JIRA tickets am I closing and those kind of things are very much a low-level technical focus. And I think if you're trying to develop an ROI to say, should we embrace DevOps, maybe what you should be looking at, I mean, automation, for example. Are you automating those processes that are manual? What's the time between having an idea and getting it out into production? So those very end-to-end metrics are clearly measurable, and you can associate cost to those. I think depending on your business, you're going to have an idea of what it is you want to get out of the solutions you put in front of your customer. So are you trying to get more people on your website because it generates other forms of revenue, or all of those types of metrics that really focus around the features you're delivering. And again, this comes back to what tooling you can use to get those metrics. So the types of monitoring tools and things like that help you. So a boring answer maybe from a consultancy perspective, but it really does depend on what type of business you are, but by focusing on the goals you have, I think the metrics will fall out from them.
Thanks, Rob. As a second question, that may be related actually, would this work in a heavily siloed organisation?
Would this work? Well, I think, and we've covered to some extent, for this to work, there needs to be a kind of large collaborative approach to doing this, and that, you know, I say it over and over, that top-down support needs to be in place. And then if you can identify your processes, so if you, for example, you have a release process that spans a number of silos, if you have a way of measuring that process and finding the bottlenecks, if you can communicate those bottlenecks to a larger audience, so if you're adopting some of the openness and the transparency, I think it is possible to start to understand why do we have these firewalls in place. It's probably from a technical perspective a bad name to use, but why have we got these silos? Why are we handing off the responsibility to the DBAs or the network team, or even actually we've outsourced some of the development? You know, what is that handover? What's the cost of that handover? And I think if as an organization you can understand that process and see where there may be waste, you can then start to address that waste. And again, that's not going to happen overnight. So yes, I think it can start to work in a siloed organization, so you can automate as much as you can within the areas you have control, but I think you will then hit other constraints that may be stopping you going as fast as you need. And if you don't have those constraints, great, the silo organization remains and so on. But I think then you become less of a siloed organization, and this is disruptive. But again, this is not easy and it doesn't happen overnight.
Thank you. There is one third question, but I think I can answer it myself. The question is this presentation available electronically afterwards? Indeed, yes, it is. We'll be making available a link to everybody. We'll send this out with a link to download the presentation afterwards, so you can watch it again and share with colleagues. I think, Rob, that seems to be all the questions for now. So again, thank you for a fantastic webinar. I hope everybody attending enjoyed it. It's great to see so many people on the presentation today. And without further ado, thank you very much and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.